So how do we get single payer? Can I suggest we need to have massive disruption of the healthcare payment system?
Most of the people protesting in the movement were believers and were demanding a civilian democratic state, دولة مدنية ديمقراطية, and appealing towards democracy, etc.
Hello, my name is Stanley Heller. Welcome to The Struggle. And welcome back to our Manhattan viewers who are seeing our show on MNN at a new time, 7:30 in the morning on Fridays, just before Democracy Now! The very professional Congressional Budget Office looked at Trump's health care plan and found it would save a piddling $30 billion a year, but at a cost, as Amy Goodman explains.
A startling new report from the Congressional Budget Office is projecting 24 million Americans will lose health insurance coverage by 2026 under the Republican plan to replace the Affordable Care Act. 14 million people will lose health insurance in the next year alone.
According to Ralph Nader on Democracy Now! On March 17th, some 35,000 people a year are dying from lack of health insurance, even now with Obamacare. Imagine the death toll when tens of millions lose their health insurance. Now listen to President Trump at a press conference.
Now, I have to tell you, it's an unbelievably complex subject. Nobody knew that healthcare could be so complicated.
Nobody knew that healthcare could be so complicated. 1,000 insurance companies want to wet their beaks, and Trump wonders why it's complicated. The solution, of course, is single-payer healthcare. Healthcare available to all Americans, paid for by taxes. But not even Bernie Sanders is talking about it right now, as Ralph Nader explains.
This is the time to move. And what do you see? The chief issue of Senator Bernie Sanders when he was running for president last year was full Medicare for all, single payer. Has he introduced a bill yet? He hasn't even introduced a bill yet in the Senate. Here's the leader of the single-payer movement being told by Chuck Schumer and others, stay low, keep quiet, Bernie. We got to deal with the Republicans trying to dismantle Obamacare.
So how do we get single-payer? Can I suggest we need to have massive disruption of the healthcare payment system? We need somehow to get tens of thousands of people together and jointly refuse to pay for health care. To go to doctors' offices and health clinics and hospitals as usual, to get health care as usual, but to refuse to pay a dime for any of this care, and to tell doctors to get their well-earned money from the government. A kind of health payments strike. A crack-brained idea? Maybe. But decades of writing letters and calling politicians have only led to Trump's Unaffordable Care Act. We need some mass direct action to win single payer. In New Haven on April 23rd, as he gets the Gandhi Peace Award along with Omar Barghouti. Free, open to the public. Now more of the brilliant talk on Syria by Swiss-Syrian Joseph Daher. Last week he was talking about how the great democratic experiments in the liberated areas were at their most significant in Aleppo.
But you had really a popular movement from below, people self-organizing completely. And this has been the greatest threat of the Assad regime since the first days, because they could propose an alternative, inclusive, democratic message to the majority of the Syrian people. And I would say in the first 2 years, they had the hegemony on the Syrian population in its majority. And one of the examples why it wanted to be completely crushed, it was because of this message. And a symbol of this is Eastern Aleppo. Eastern Aleppo was liberated at the end of the summer 2012 by various opposition armed forces. At the beginning of October, you had the Revolutionary Local Council that was established between an agreement with the armed opposition forces and civilian forces. In March 2013, you had the establishment of the local council following democratic elections through indirect ways, through neighborhoods, councils, etc. Each year, you had new elections for the local council of Aleppo until the last one in November 2015. Hundreds of popular organizations popped out, organized democratic campaigns, cultural campaigns, welcoming refugees. You had 1.5 million people living in these areas. At the beginning of the summer 2013, witnessing this threat of Eastern Aleppo, people self-organizing on a massive scale, we're talking about 1.5 million people. It was the beginning of the barrel bombs massively being dropped on these areas. At the end of in the beginning of January 2014, 600,000 people had left. 600,000 people had left these areas because of the massive dropping of barrel bombs. On a daily basis, we're talking about nearly daily basis. This continued throughout the 2014 year, and it wasn't enough. Russian aviation intervention at the beginning of October 2015 added to the pressure on various civilian democratic forces, especially on Eastern Aleppo. In the summer of 2016, you had 250,000 people left that were suffering a harsh siege by Assad, pro-regime forces, and various allies. At the end, as you know, December 2016, we witnessed a new crimes against humanity, because forced displacement is a crime against humanity. 50,000 people had to leave Eastern Aleppo following the conquest of Assad pro-regime forces and its allies. And you have a couple of examples like Eastern Aleppo. Eastern Aleppo being a symbol because of its largest, the massive population, etc. But you had the case of Daraya, you had the case of other cities witnessing the same fate of the forced displacement, sieges, etc. And it's important to remember the popular movement in the first 2 years was composed of all the various components of the same people. Obviously, the majority was Arab Sunni, but because the majority of the population is Arab Sunni. But you had Christians, Alawites, Druze, whatever, Arabs and Kurds. And actually, at the beginning of the uprising, I will come back on this issue, even in Kurdish areas, they were organizing on the same system of local coordination committees. There was a turning point in the summer of 2013, locally and regionally. Locally, it was the Ghouta chemical massacre that occurred, and I don't think today there's any kind of debate on the author of these crimes. It's the Assad regime, this is very clear, that killed more than 1,000 civilian population in the province of Damascus. You had an internal crisis within the Syrian revolution because some sections of the Free Syrian Army had expected the assistance of the West because this was the red line, so-called red line imposed by Obama. We could see no kind of intervention and a deal with the Assad regime and Putin. Regionally also, there was a change. It was the establishment of Daesh in 2013 Iraq and the coup in Egypt, Sisi crushing any kind of opposition in front of it. First of all, the Muslim Brotherhood and other progressive and democratic forces in Egypt. So you had in 2013 an advance of the various counter-revolutionary forces massively because of the massive repression of authoritarian regime elsewhere in the region. And this is where in Syria you witnessed the rise, especially, but even before they were present, but especially after this, the rise of Islamic fundamentalist forces. Just an apartheid on this term, Islamic fundamentalist forces. Knowing I'm speaking in a Western country where you have high amount of Islamophobia against all kinds of Muslims, I want to make clear distinction Islamic Fundamentalist Party is a political party with a reactionary political program that want to establish an Islamic state on a reactionary basis, sectarian, anti-woman, anti-religious minorities, etc., which is completely different from a Muslim believer. And we should oppose the Islamophobic discourse saying all Muslim believers are just like, jihadi, etc. So to make things very clear, it's completely different to speak of Islamic fundamentalism and to be a believer. The majority of the Syrian popular movement were believers. And actually the Syrian society was quite conservative, we speak very clearly. Most of the people protesting in the movement were believers and were demanding a civilian democratic state, Dawla Madaniyya Demokratiyya, and appealing towards democracy, etc. So it's completely different, this thing, and it's important to say. Just before coming back to the rise of Islamic fundamentalism, how did the militarization occur? First of all, it was forced upon the Syrian people. It's very important to understand. It was a big debate among activists. Should we support the militarization or not? How do we collaborate or not? What do we ignore it or not? At the end, this debate became nearly futile because of the massive militarization. But it's important to say that the FSA was never a single united institution. It never had even a leadership united. It never had a political program. And actually, its nature, its composition varied massively according to regions. It was composed of various components of the Syrian people, but also ideologically. Nader made an interview in 2012 with a particular FSA unit that had, leftist, nationalist, perspective. In Douma, actually, you had an opposition between a group that was mostly close to the Nasserite party, that had a Nasserite Arab nationalist opposition to the regime, historical roots in the region, and the Liwa Islam Brigade that would become Jaish al-Islam. So it was a very, we should have a nuanced position towards FSA unit, not romanticizing it, seeing its components that varied. In the north, you had Arabic, Kurdish, FSA units together, various ideology, etc. We can come back later. But unfortunately, throughout the years, the FSA units were marginalized for different reasons. It never had been supportedly, constantly, and whether politically, militarily, financially. And the so-called friends of Syria, and I will come back on them later, but if you have friends like this, leave them now. They will only bring you problems. Saudi Arabia, Qatar, and Turkey trying to divide the various FSA units to instrumentalize them for their own interest. Today, the majority of FSA units have been marginalized, the democratic sections of the FSA, which there was a poll in the mid-2012 among FSA officers, etc. What is the system do you envision for the future of Syria? Is Assad is overthrown. Majority answered a democracy in Syria, rule of law, etc. Today, you have a complete instrumentalization of some sections of the FSA. In the south, by Jordan, preventing any kind of actions of FSA forces, only to fight Daesh, so-called Islamic State. In the north, you had the instrumentalization of various FSA forces by Turkey that withdrew more than 4,000 soldiers of the FSA in the summer 2016 in Aleppo, eastern Aleppo, to participate in the military intervention in northern Syria against the so-called Islamic State, but more importantly, against the Kurdish PYD forces. So, unfortunately, they'll be marginalized. We can come back later. Why are Islamic fundamentalist forces a section of the counter-revolution, as I call them? And not only in Syria, but in the region. Because their political program is opposed to the original objectives of the revolution for democracy, social justice, and equality. They use a sectarian discourse just as the old regimes, authoritarian regimes do, dividing the people based on religious sect. They oppose human rights. They oppose even democratic rights, and they oppose social rights. They have a neoliberal program fully, and they've been in contact with various sections of, if you want, states such as Qatar, Saudi Arabia, and Turkey that are far from willing to see democracy rise in the region. Secondly, because they have attacked massively democratic forces within Syria. And one of the symbols of the revolution, such as Ghazan Zaytouni, in Duma in December 2013. She was one of the founders of the local coordination committee in Syria, a feminist, and playing a humongous role among Syrian revolutions. An example for a lot of pro-Syrian revolution. And other attacks, they attacked various sectors of the democratic sectors of the revolution. And until today, for example, in the past few days, you had massive demonstrations and strikes in a small town of Aleppo province called Atarib to protest against the attempts of Jabhat al-Nusra, former Al-Qaeda, to take the control of the bakery, which would allow them to control the whole region. And I could cite many examples like this of various attempts of Islamic fundamentalist forces trying to break the democratic sections of the revolution. And there have been contradictions in the territories where you had armed opposition forces dominated by these forces and civilian resistance, democratic resistance. We can come back on, but it's very important to understand that contrary to other maybe revolution or revolutionary process, in the Middle East and North Africa, you have both sections of the counter-revolution, old regime and Islamic fundamentalist forces that have opposed constantly, not only on a political program basis, but the Democrats and progressive, attack them, especially in Syria. This has been very clear. This does not mean in the same time that we should support the repression, for example, in Egypt, of the Muslim Brotherhood by the Sisi regime. We should oppose it because we stand in solidarity and for democratic rights for all political prisoners. Even before the uprising in Syria, I was opposed to the imprisonment of Salafists, etc. You stand in solidarity with democratic rights. Just as in the US, I saw there might be a ban against the Muslim Brotherhood. You should oppose it completely. You should stand very clear on democratic principles. But this does not mean that you do an economy of the analysis of this kind of political parties as well. So it's a clarity that is needed. What was the position of the various regional and imperial international powers? I think that the role of Russia and Iran and the political group of Hezbollah in Lebanon is very clear. They participated massively in the crime, the destruction of Syria. By intervening from the beginning, end of 2011, beginning of 2012, to crush the protesters throughout Syria. And they should be denounced completely for this. And I think one of the problems of the section of the left has been to limit imperialism to actors, to one or two actors. In other words, the US or Western power. Whereas you have to understand imperialism as a system in which capitalist forces, capitalist states fight each other or can collaborate. This is what we're witnessing this today to crush all the popular revolution. But that various imperialist forces exist internationally or regionally, and that we should oppose all of them. So Russia, Iran, and Hezbollah as a political group played a catastrophic role and a criminal role to crush the uprising. And I don't think it needs more debate on this issue. Regarding, I think, and this needs a bit more debate among Syrian Solidarity Group and Syrian revolutionaries, has been the role of Turkey and Gulf monarchies. And this is why I will spend a bit more time on this issue. Saudi Arabia and Qatar, first of all, these countries with Turkey see in the first 6 months of the uprising wanted a solution between the Assad regime and the Muslim Brotherhood. They pushed for this kind of negotiation to put a deal. And US was quite supportive of this as well. And following the complete refusal of the Assad regime for this kind of deal, they supported rhetorically the revolution. But before 2011, these regimes were great allies of the Assad regime. Saudi Arabia was the first foreign investor in Syria. Qatar was a great ally. And Erdogan used to spend his vacation with his mate Bashar al-Assad, saying they're great brothers, you know, etc. And they had great political, economic relationship. After, especially the Gulf monarchies, and I think we have to do a parallel by the way Saudi Arabia intervened in Syria and in Bahrain. The nature of this intervention is different, but the objectives are similar, to break the democratic aspiration of people. So therefore, in Bahrain, in March 2015, which interestingly, Syria supported the intervention of the Gulf monarchies to crush the Bahraini revolution. They crushed the at least they tried to crush the Bahraini revolution, Gulf monarchies. In Syria, they did it in a different way. They were scared of the radicalness and the democratic aspiration of the Syrian people. Therefore, they wanted to transform this democratic popular revolution into a sectarian civil war. And this is why they supported the most reactionary groups within the Syrian revolution. For example, Jaish al-Islam, Islam Army that are heading the armed opposition groups peace talk in Astana, Kazakhstan, was the most important group being funded by Saudi Arabia for the past few years. While Qatar and Turkey funded or assisted directly or indirectly various Islamic fundamentalist groups. They were scared that a successful revolution would bring democracy in Syria that could serve an example for their own population that were also witnessing protest movement in Saudi Arabia, Bahrain, and various cities. Therefore, they wanted to transform this popular revolution into a sectarian revolution. And Turkey, which supported various Islamic fundamental forces first, wanted also to transform and to help its main, foreign partner in the various uprising, the Muslim Brotherhood. But after, its main intervention was against the PYD forces of the Kurds, preventing any kind of Kurdish autonomy. It's interesting to know that these attempts of these groups, of these states, was parallel by the Assad regime that had the same objective, to sectarianize the uprising. How? By crushing any kind of democratic groups, progressive groups, local councils, while letting the expansion and liberating at the beginning of the uprising the main key leaders of previous jihadist forces and Salafist forces with which the regime had collaborated in 2000 following the US-British war on Iraq, and they were supporting Salafist jihadist forces. So Zahran al-Lush and others, key leaders of the Islamic fundamentalist forces, were in prison and were liberated in amnesty, while the democratic forces were completely crushed. They were led to expand. And the best example is Raqqa. I'm not asking Raqqa to be bombed, on the opposite, I oppose it. But Raqqa, since Daesh took over, never witnessed the massive scale of bombing as other areas of Syria controlled by the democratic forces. And for example, the Russian intervention followed a similar model. So you had the same objectives from the Assad regime and Gulf monarchies. On the role of the US, they never wanted regime change in Syria. This is a key issue you have to understand. And Clinton said at the beginning of the uprising, Assad is a reformer. So if you inherited the power from your father, you're a reformer. And Assad had a long history of collaboration, and we can come back on this on the Q&A. One of the biggest lies of the Assad regime is that it is anti-imperial. It has collaborated with various international imperialist forces, being the US, Russia, or crush Palestinian forces, progressive forces in Syria and outside of Syria. The biggest lessons, and these people did not understand, they stayed before 2003, the analysis regarding US foreign policy in the Middle East. First of all, following the arrival of Barack Obama in the region, as president, the main focus of US foreign policy was China. So transferring naval force towards Asia and the Pacific, while trying to withdraw from the Middle East. Because the biggest lesson of Iraq, it was a big defeat. Iraq was handed over in some ways to the influence of Iran. And therefore, it was not anymore regime change, the main objective, but maintaining regime while including sections of the opposition most likely to be ready to accept US role in the region. And this is what the Muslim Brotherhood were taken. But this changed with the new administration. But I think this is very important. And we can come back on this. And US even prevented some delivery provision of Pacific arms demanded by FSA forces, etc. Before concluding, I would say a couple of words on the Kurdish issue. The Kurdish people have been oppressed for the past few decades, even more, in the region. Not only in Syria, but in the whole region. I will speak now more precisely on Syria. Since 1946, even before the establishment of the Assad regime in 1970, Kurdish people have been oppressed nationally, culturally, socially. And they were deprived of the nationality in 1962, in the census of Hasake. They were not allowed to speak their languages. their language, sorry. There were a colonization policy in Kurdish inhabited areas. So massive repression even before Assad regime arrived to the power. So there's no question on this. At the beginning of the uprising, as I said, Kurdish youth followed the same system of organization than the LCC in other areas of Syria. And two main parties were much involved in it. It was the Yekiti party, which was a leftist democratic Kurdish party that had a history of struggling against the Assad regime and suffered massively from it, and making links with various democratic forces of the same Arab opposition. And the second one was the Future Movement of Michel Tamo, whose leader was killed in autumn 2011. In 2012, in the summer of 2012, the regime withdrew from some areas, majority inhabited by the Kurdish people. And in a pragmatic agreement to the sister organization of PKK, gave these areas to the PYD to rule them. It's important to know that following the uprising and until the summer 2012, PKK sister organization PYD was allowed by the regime to come back massively in Syria from Mount Kandil. Armed militants were allowed to come back and build on their forces. Rojava institution, a lot is to say on it. There are some very positive issues that I think we cannot put aside, like participation, involvement of women on different scales, secularization of law, to a certain extent, religious and ethnic tolerance, and I think it should be acknowledged. At the same time, there are problems, and I think there has been a romanticization of Rojava institution, presenting it like the new Commune de Paris, Paris Commune, like new Bolshevik, etc. Well, this is PYD remained to be a very authoritarian party, preventing other Kurdish political parties to organize and repressing them very harshly.
The concluding section of Daher's talk on next week's program. On April 10th, Voices for Creative Nonviolence and a number of other groups will be holding a week-long fast in front of the Isaiah Wall at the United Nations in New York City to protest the horrific Saudi-U.S. war on Yemenis. See SaudiUS.org for details. We're done. Thanks for watching. I'm Stanley Heller for The Struggle.